Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Well, we begin our study today, and in recognition of the light outside, the skies have cleared, at least here in Palm Springs. We are looking forward to the rain, and we appreciate the rain, but the light shining right now is part of the overall metaphor of the last 24 hours, I would say. So we begin with the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We give praise and we give thanks to the Holy One for making it our lot to be part of this ongoing discussion of reading and rereading, interpreting and reinterpreting, of dealing, surrounding ourselves with the words of Torah. May we do so with respect, not only for the ancient text, but for each other, as we exchange views and model that which we hope will be the case in this country going forward. As usual, I guess I should have waited. I see people are still joining, so we'll hold off with the beginning of the text for a second. As usual, if you'd like to say something, just go ahead and unmute yourself because I can't see everybody. You are able to unmute yourselves if you want to say something. If you wave, I probably won't see you. I only see a few at the top of my screen, although I guess I could probably change that, but depending on how many will be here today. Yeah, we're too many. So, so please just go ahead and speak up. We're going to go at a quicker, much quicker pace today. I'm not sorry that we took so long in the first two meetings because we were able to point out a few different things, especially how important, at least for me in teaching, is the history of interpretation and looking at the various strata of comments that were made over the last 3,000 years, and try to find perhaps the meaning of the simple text, the pshat, but also to understand that there's always different levels, and of course to get to what the meanings might mean for us today as well. A little bit difficult in our material today, not just because we'll be going at a quicker pace, but also because of the nature. This is the part of it is repeating, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago. Part of the beginning of Judges is repeating that which was already told in Joshua. It's done a little bit differently. It's not that interesting to compare the two, at least I don't think so, in our first episode here, the tale of Achsa. But that is something one might want to do if you want to look in the parallels. Any commentary will tell you where the parallels are, or in general, if you want to read before we go on further in Judges, I think I suggested perhaps read through Joshua, a cursory read. Okay. So may I ask someone to read? Alan, would you like to read 12 to 15, please? Go ahead.
Good morning. From there they marched against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiryat Seifer. And Caleb announced, I will give my daughter Asach in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiryat Seifer. His younger kinsman, Othniel the Kenizzite, captured it, and Caleb gave him his daughter Asach in marriage. When she came to him, she induced him to ask her father for some property. She dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb asked her, What is the matter? She replied, Give me a present, for you have given me away as Negev land. Give me springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper and lower Goach.
Okay. So we're continuing with this. Remember, they asked who goes up first. Judah goes up first, and we're continuing now this kind of repetition of how the Israelites moved into the land, conquered the land. And now we're turning to this particular place. After we did Hebron, Kiryat Arba last week, we have this other place, Dvir, which is known as Kiryat Seifer. As many of you know, the word Sefer means book, And so many people have suggested this was kind of the scriptorium city, the city of scribes. In Game of Thrones, there's that city where all the wise men train, and it's filled with books. That's how I imagine it. Kiryat Seifer. And there's a place today called Kiryat Seifer outside of Jerusalem. I'm guessing it's because somebody found something, some archaeological site there, or because it was left over in the older Arabic names. One way or another, we're talking about the land of the area of Judah. So that's the area surrounding Jerusalem, right? Not Jerusalem itself, but Jerusalem kind of going southwards, maybe a little bit to the west. And now we have this interesting story, which is not unique for ancient culture, right? This idea of marrying, speaking of Game of Thrones, right? Or speaking of European history, or perhaps even speaking of this country amongst aristocrats, these marrying of families together in order to reach a wider power, wider consensus, whatever it might be. And then there's this theme or this motif of a contest, so to speak, right? Whoever does that, whoever conquers such place for me, says the general, gets my daughter. And you'll remember that from other cases, even in the Hebrew Bible itself. Now, who is Caleb? Anybody remember who Caleb is? Caleb? We had him already in the Torah. He's Joshua's partner in the two spies that came back with a positive version of what they saw in the promised land. Caleb ben Yefuneh, or in English, Caleb. And of course, that means dog. Not a great name, not a kind of name you'd think of naming your child, perhaps. But maybe because he's consistently, he's with it. He's still at it, right? Joshua is gone, and he's still at it. He's continuing that conquest of the land. Hard to know. Not sure that every name has meaning, or meaning that we can get to. And so who wins the prize? Otniel. Otniel is a name, a theophoric name with L at the end. That is, Otni is my L, and we don't know what Otni is. Rotni, maybe, perhaps, based on the Greek translation. We don't know, but it's probably a theophoric name of a different god. And that already you can see it matches the fact that he's a Kenizzite, right? He's not originally from the ancient tribes. He's come in from another people. There were mixtures. The most famous, perhaps, is Uriah the Hittite, right? And even though these are countries, these are nations that will be the enemies, still there was this seeping in, this exchange of people, certainly of women, right? But we don't hear about their names because women were captured. But in this case, we the enemy becomes not only one of ours, but also becomes a general of sorts. Okay, repeat for those that joined us in the last few minutes. If you want to say something, just go ahead, unmute and say it, because I can't see you if you're waving. We are in Judges, I should have mentioned Judges 1, 11 to 40. I actually added on a verse there, I think. And if you don't have the sheet, you can look in the chat box. You can download the sheet as well. Okay, so we have this story, which would not be that noteworthy, right? If the daughter was given in exchange. The rabbis of the Talmud did not like this story, not because the reasons perhaps we don't like it, because it's turning a woman into it's objectifying a woman. Let's see, Harold says he's trying, we can unmute yourselves. So it says here, sorry, Atek, it says that you are allowed to, and we've had this problem before. So if I, you know what, Madalena, if you're on this, please go ahead and ask people to unmute. Just because you're asked to unmute doesn't mean you have to unmute, but that's worked in the past, that when we ask somebody to unmute and they unmute, it works. We've had this problem. So in the meantime, let me go to John, if I can find you. John, I'm asking you to unmute now if you wanted to say something. Go ahead, John.
Well, I was going to answer who Caleb was, but you answered it. I'm
I'm
fine.
sorry. I just assumed that people were quiet because they didn't remember. All right, silly me. And Harold, was that yours as well? Go ahead, Harold. I just asked you to unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I was going to do exactly what he did. I was going to answer the Caleb question.
Great. Okay. So, all right. So I guess what you're going to need to do is probably, if you can't get out, then just send a message. But please mute yourself again if you've unmuted and you're not talking. Mute yourself again. All right. You think that we would get better at this, but I'm not sure it's us. I think there actually is a problem with. I know there's a problem with Zoom on this particular thing. Okay. So, but that story would be interesting. Okay, enough. But it gets more interesting. And even before Achsa, let's just take a look at her name. We don't know what her name means. Maybe it means ornament, like jewelry. But even before she makes her request, which is a pretty ballsy request, the words in Hebrew is she jumps. It's almost she jumps off. She gets off of her donkey. The fact that she's riding a donkey is no big thing. We got a lot of people riding donkeys, and I'm not sure we need to read into that too much. Who rides a donkey, and what gender the donkey is, right? But some people do that. But she gets off of the donkey. I'm reminded of Rebecca getting off of the camel and kind of sliding off of the camel in that story in elegance, and kind of meeting her husband for the first time, and he falls in love and says, well. He says only then was he comforted for the death of his mother, which is a problematic issue, right? If that's what you say about your wife. But here she kind of, it feels like she's jumping off, and then and there's something a little bit abrupt about it. And then what he says to her is, he says, it's malach. Malach in Hebrew is pretty curt. It's like in English, if somebody say, what, now what? That's how, now perhaps I'm reading into it, but that's how I feel this is. There's something off here, right? And what I want to say is that if you treat a woman like chattel in this way, right? If the father says whoever wins this battle gets this woman, that's this daughter, well, then that's going to create a certain culture around it. And she gets off, and right away she says, well, wait a minute, I want a better deal, right? The deal that you gave, that's not a good enough deal. I want what you've given us. And she's speaking for him, right? And so she's kind of she's taking over, so to speak, even though he won the war, she's taking over. We don't want the land that you've given us. You've given us desert, arid land. You've given us this wilderness land. We want good land with water. And that's the etiological story or etiological story that explains how it came to be that these people, this family, lived in this place called Gulot. Gulot from the root galal, which has to do with waves. I think that's the connection, but it's usually in connection with water. Okay, comments or questions about that little mini anecdote there? If you're trying to say something and you can't, just put a note in the chat box. Okay. So, David Friedman, 16.
Unmute. Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Okay.
Yeah.
The descendants of the Kenite, the father-in-law of Moses, went up with the Judites from the city of Palms to the wilderness of Judah, and they went and settled among the people in the Negev of Arad.
Oh, a short sentence, relatively short section, but a lot of stuff to unpack. The first thing is the Kenim, this nation of the Kenites, who is the father-in-law of Moses. But does anybody remember something else about the father-in-law of Moses?
Reuel?
Well, that's the name, but how about when it comes to, was he a Kenite? A Kenite?
I don't think so. But I
No,
can't
he
remember.
was a Midianite.
Yeah, it was a midnight, and
Right.
he was a pagan priest.
Midianite, that's right.
He was a pagan priest.
Right. So
Right.
there's a Kohen Midian when we meet him in one place. In
Mhm.
another place, we meet him as perhaps the eyes, like a Bedouin tracker, or what do you call it? The person who leads, yeah, like a scout in numbers here, and there's a few others. So, and then it doesn't say what his name is here, right? Just as it's his father-in-law. But of course, it could also mean it's his brother-in-law. The word choten could also be pointed chatan. And there's a lot of issues with when it comes to Jethro. Remember that those that were studying together, remember we got to Jethro once and we saw that he had, the Midrash gives him 7 different names, right? So, because there seems to be a lot of very fuzzy traditions relating to Moses's father-in-law, a priest, Kenite, Midianite. And then there's this issue, where are the Midianites? Well, if Moses met up with Zipporah and her family, that had to be close to Egypt, right? That's down south someplace, not up here in the promised land. So there's a lot of fuzziness about the Midianites, Kenites, Jethro, Chovav, Ruel, the different names of whoever was Moses's father-in-law, brother-in-law. We just have to accept it. The one thing that perhaps we might say about the geography is that it was a nomadic people. The Midianites were nomadic, and they do appear in different places in the Torah, in the narratives of the Torah already. So here, this is a passage just telling us why it explains why one particular area was settled by these people who are Kenites. Maybe they're related to Midianites. There's articles written about this stuff. I've never really been interested enough to read through them. And then we get this name, the city of palms. Does that sound familiar to anybody?
Jericho.
Jericho, exactly. Kiryat Marim is another name for Jericho because it was so famous for the palm trees. So that gives you an idea where it's situated. Oh, this map is not a good one. But for those that know the map a little bit, and I did bring a map that last time. Maybe I should pull up the map. Maybe at the end we'll pull up the map to go over what the areas we saw. So Judah is the Kalev. I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. So we're still in the land of Judah, okay? So now we get to 17 to 20. Mariah, would you read? Oh, there you go. Thank you for pulling that up. All right. So you can see over here, Jericho.
Where?
That's Jericho. Judah's land is down here. The place today, which is Kiryat Seifer, is right around here. So probably the upper part of Judah. And again, Simon being totally surrounded by. So we're talking about this area of Judah right now here, from Jericho at the top, going downwards to the Negev. This is the Negev down here. Okay, we can leave that now, please, Madalena.
That's
And
good.
we're going now to 1720. Mariah, if you could read, please.
And Judah, with its brother tribe, Simeon, went on and defeated the Canaanites who dwelt in Zephath. They prescribed it, and so the town was named Hormah. And Judah captured Gaza and its territory, Ashkelon and its territory, and Ekron and its territory. The Lord was with Judah, so they took possession of the hill country, but they were not able to dispossess the inhabitants of the plain, for they had iron chariots. They gave Hebron to Caleb, and Moses, as Moses had promised, and he drove the 3 Anakites out of there.
Okay, so if we could go back to the map for a second, please, Madalena.
Yes, give me a second.
Okay. So we go from Judah to Simon to Shimon. They're brothers, right? They're closely related, as you can see here, as we've seen before. And this is the area they're talking about. So they pressed westward. And in the west, you've got, it was a little bit larger before. Is that possible? There you go. Thanks. And so as they press west, this is where the Philistines are. The Philistines are in Gaza and Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gat and Gerar. No, they're not. Yeah, Gerar. Yeah, these are the. And I'm sorry, Ekron and Gat. These five are the five major cities of the Philistines, so they were able to capture some of these. Right, some of these. The text says they were able to capture Gaza and its territory, Ashkelon and its territory, but over here, it doesn't sound like they made headway, because over here they had chariots, or it means that they were pushed back. So they could do what they could do, but this area is going to be a thorn in the side of the Israelites in the entire book going forward. And as many of you know, it features greatly in the Samson stories, and Samson is from Dan, from this area here. Okay. And then finally, we have this word we can go back to the screens now, the regular screen now. Finally, they have this, finally they have this, this renaming of the city of Tzfat, to rename it to Hormah. And Hormah from the root cherem, which is when you don't touch something. I know we use cherem today as kind of somebody who's been excommunicated. A cherem is a boycott in modern Hebrew, but here it's that it meant that they didn't take anything from the spoils of war. And there's a difficult distinction between different places and what were the conditions of doing that and not doing that. But that's not for now. That's more for the study of the book of Joshua, I would say. And for those that recognize the name Tzfat, it's not the same Tzfat as you're thinking of in the northern part of Israel, and we'll see that quite a bit. There are a lot of places that have a lot of names that are in different locations, like Beit Lechem. There's one in Judah, but there's also one in the north, not just today. That's the fact. That's why the New Testament emphasizes that it was Beit Lechem in Judea, where Jesus was born. There's a number of Gilgals. Gilgal means a kind of a circle of stone, like a Stonehenge kind of a thing. And so their names repeat. There is not just one. There's only one Kiryat Marim, only one city of palms, which is Jericho. Only one Ekron, right? But some of these other names, they're repeated quite a bit. And then the passage goes off with kind of summing up that this is what that Moses already had promised to Caleb. This property, this area of as a Judite, this area of Hebron, of Kiryat Arba, and again reiterating that which we saw at the end of last week's session, having to do with those giants, the Anakites, the Anakim, Bnei Anak, that were defeated. Okay. All right. Questions? Okay.
I have a question, but
Go ahead.
hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I wondered about Deborah. She's a prophetess. I didn't think women were prophetess.
Right. So she's a prophet. She's a judge, actually, of all the judges in the book of Judges that we talked about in the first time, Shoftim. She's really the only one who actually acts as a judge. And we're going to get to her. That's chapter 4. Chapter 4. So my guess is we'll get there in about a month from now.
Oh,
so we'll
okay.
wait to talk. So women are. So don't forget, Diane, that Miriam had a role as well. It was a relatively minor role compared to her brothers, but still she had a role. And she's even called Miriam HaNeviah. She even has that title as Miriam the prophet. There's another prophet, Huldah, who is a female prophet in the book of Kings, and then there's others that are just major characters, like the mothers in the stories. You might remember that Rebecca has twins, and she doesn't know what's going on. They're fighting in her stomach, so she goes to talk to God, Lidrosh et Elohim. And so even though other post-biblical commentators wanted to say that, well, she really went to one of the men. The biblical text itself says that she had direct contact. So yes, it's not as common, of course, but it's still there. And we'll get to a juxtaposition of two female heroes, one Dvorah, the other one Yael, who handle the situation in very different ways.
Rabbi, one quick question. The Anakites, there were 3 of them, according to this. These are giants, you say. Are they the same giant that would have been in the story of David with Goliath? Goliath?
It's probably related. Well, there were 4 of them, right? There's 3 here, but the passage that we did at the end of last time, remember the place was called Kiryat Arba, the town of 4, or the city of 4, or the area of 4 towns. There's this mythology of some of the ancient enemies are giants. Are they related to, are related blood relations? No, because Goliath, the Philistine, he's from a different people. But they're common in there. You may remember Og as well, Og, the king of Bashan, and Sichon Melech HaAmori. Og is a giant, and he's part of Bashan. So it's not that they're part of the same family, but they're part of the same family of memories of the ancient giants, right? This ancient mythology. So that they're not familial in blood. They're familial from a literary point of view, right? Right. Which means they're family to giants in other tales from other places in ancient culture.
Exactly. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
That's what I had to say. Anything else?
Rabbi.
Yeah, yes, John.
I noticed you bold-faced some letters that I caught in my own personal Bible that were not bold-faced, but the Lord was with Judah, but then along with the high country success, he didn't succeed in driving out the people. I thought that was a little strange. He was with Judah, but Judah really wasn't able to fulfill his task.
Well, so here's the thing. What we're going to get to the Judah was with, when we compare it with the pieces that are going downwards, we're going to see is that's why I boldened it. But the question is a good question. But it assumes, John, you're assuming that the Lord wants them to win every battle and to conquer every area. And you might say that because, well, that's the land that was given to them. Except for Mabat Lachor, in a retrospect, looking back at it, the narrator is telling us God gave Judah what Judah should have got at that moment. He was victorious in those battles that God wanted him to win. It's not like he lost everything, he won a lot, right? He won a lot of his area. But the Philistines, no, noch nicht, as you would say in the Methodist Church, noch nicht, not yet. We know that you guys.
That was going to be my question. Was it a matter of timing? Sometimes we don't have patience for God's timing.
Right. So if I'm taking a meta-biblical view, certainly of the book of Judges, I would say, and perhaps there are rabbis that said this, and maybe I'm just mimicking something I heard over the years, but I would say if Judah was to have taken Gaza, that whole area of the Philistines, I say Gaza because many of you know that I lived in the Gaza Strip. So for me, Gaza is the entire Gaza Strip. But if they were to take those Philistine cities, then there wouldn't have been a story of Samson. And we need that story of Samson to teach us something else. That I'm saying with a smile kind of thing, right? That you need to, everything has its time and its place. But another lesson is, and this, now I'm jumping forward politically to 20th century, Zionism and politics in Israel today, is that I think we can also say just because something was promised in ancient times doesn't mean it's the right thing. In other words, deals are made, decisions are made, but reality changes. Reality changes on the ground. It changes, and you could take that where you like it in the United States, take it where you like it around the world. But in particular, as far as those that would say that the Jewish people have a right to all the lands that were promised to Abraham, well, the fact of the matter is never, even in David's time really, was all the land given. In other words, there's a promise and then there's reality. And that's people will choose which way they want to go on this, but this is in the background. So I would say that a more left-leaning teacher of Bible might take this opportunity if it's a school that believes in making the sleep, just like Orthodox schools in Israel absolutely do that kind of indoctrination. I would say that a liberal leap would be is to raise here, yes, God was with them, and yet they didn't get everything they were promised. And there's an answer to a certain question there as well.
Thank you.
Okay. So Ella, would you go on? Could we do, we just did two of Leah's sons, the mother Leah. Now we go to Rachel's son, Benjamin. Could you go ahead? And Benjamin and Joseph.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. Verse 21, please.
The Benjaminites did not dispossess the Jebusite inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have dwelt with the Benjaminites in Jerusalem to this day.
And I gave you that one because you asked about the Jebusites last week and Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was not built by David. I know many people think that Jerusalem built David. No, it was captured by David. And so, and that we know from, from the book of Kings, from the book of Samuel. Now, what does that say about a verse that says, Ad hayom hazeh, to this very day, the Benjaminites lived together with the Jebusites? It could mean that that's an ancient verse. And it could mean that this is before it was taken by David, or it could mean that even the story about David taking Jerusalem, it was always a city that was together. Until this very day, whenever this book was edited, when these words, and until this very day are the giveaways with every editor, right? That's how you're able to say when an editor of a book or a book was finished before or after a certain time in history. And so this too, because I promised at the beginning of this class we would go to modern politics. One might say to those that think that Jerusalem needs to be only Jewish, one might say that even the Benjaminites in the time of the judges did not succeed until this very day. Or one might say, yeah, and they failed, and we're going to succeed. Again, I'm not here to put up one flag, but to share with you how these are things that happen. These are things that are in the background of a conversation, even if somebody didn't just study the book of Judges, because it's in the ethos of biblical education. Scotty said in our first meeting, and asked people how they relate to the book of Judges. He says he knows from being on so many tours. Scotty and I, we know each other from Jerusalem. That's where we met. Lived in Israel for many, many years. And whenever you go out on a tiyul, whenever you go out on a hike, an excursion, you have your Bible in your hand, right? Just like our Christian friends here that have been on a study tour to Israel, you also go. You just have a larger book to go with, right? Because you want to look at the sites that are meaningful for Christianity. And so it's in the background. I do believe it's in the background. Okay. Anybody want to say anything about this, the Jebusites?
A question.
Yes,
about
Ella.
Beginning. Isn't it unusual that Achsa asked for better land?
Yeah, she's got chutzpah. That's kind of what I said. I used the euphemism ballsy. I probably shouldn't have used that. She's got chutzpah. She's definitely chutzpah. So what I tried to say there, Ella, was for those that say, wait a minute, that's not the woman's place to do that. I'm talking about in older times. Well, my answer was, yeah, you treat a woman like chattel. You auction her off to the highest bidder, so to speak. The guy who does, that's what you get. You get a woman who has, let's call it courage. A woman who, a wedding based on that's what I said, matchmaking, military matchmaking. You create a certain kind of culture around it. Yeah, it is surprising, very much so, Ella. Anybody else before we go on?
How about Rabbi?
Yes, Michael.
Can you, I'm interested about this question of promises. And because if you look at the Hebrew for what Moses said, it just said, he said, diber. So how do you, it's translated in English as promise. How do you know what someone says is a promise or not?
That's a really good question. That has a lot to do with translating. And I only looked at the New Jewish Publication Society. I would imagine that, Dan, do you happen to have Alter's translation for this with you? No, okay. That would be a question for Robert Alter, because he's very careful about that kind of stuff. My guess is because it's taken from the story in Numbers, in Numbers, where Moses does speak to Kalev in this way, and in the context there, it's a promise. It's not just speech, it's a promise. So that gives the translators license here to use the word promise instead of just saying, right? But one could argue, and for that I'd have to look. If anybody has another translation handy, if there's another word, please speak up.
Which verse?
We're looking at 20, verse 20. They gave Hebron to Caleb as Moses had promised. But good eye.
I have a different translation in a new set of books, a 3-volume book on the Hebrew Bible, and it has the exact words, and they gave Hebron to Caleb as Moses had spoken. It didn't say promise, it says spoken.
Right. Good. Good. So my guess would be that would be the background of this translation. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to take the time to see what he does. All right. Okay. Anything else? Okay. So Rita Clara, you up for reading today?
Yes. Okay,
We're at verse 22. We just did the first, not the first son in order, but one of Rachel's sons, because we had Leah's sons before that. Now we have Rachel's sons. Go ahead.
The house of Joseph, for their part, advanced against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. While the house of Joseph was scouting at Bethel, the name of the town was formerly Luz. The patrols saw a man leaving the town. They said to him, "Just show us how to get into the town and we will treat you kindly." He showed them how to get into the town. They put the town to the sword, but they let the man and all his relatives go free. The man went to the Hittite country. He founded a city and called it Luz, and that has been its name to this day.
So any of this sound familiar to somebody? Bethel and Luz?
Luz?
Well, when we first met Bethel, where we have a story of it being founded by Jacob. You remember on his way out of the promised land, when he's being sent by his mother to find a wife in Mesopotamia, in the east, and he puts his head down on a rock and dreams about the ladder going up and down, right? So and then he calls this place Beit El, the house of God. Although we have in Canaanite literature, there's I think quite a bit about Bethel, and it's Beit El. It's one word, it's not two, and perhaps that's the name of the god. Fuzzy memories of learning about it from Professor Weinfeld in the past, in the 80s. But here, it's clear that the city exists, and it was called Luz. And then there's one guy who's deceitful, right? Who's traitorous to his own people. He shows them the back door in, and then he goes and he takes that name of the place and plants it someplace else in Hittite country. Okay, so it clouds the water a little bit between the relationship between Luz and Beit El, and unclear, perhaps wanting to say that it was a cleansing of sort from the Luz not being the theological name, the theophoric name, and cleansing it more for an Israelite kind of a place. And you'll notice that here too, the Lord was with Joseph. Okay. Questions or comments before we go on? Okay, now please don't despair. I know this is kind of very choppy, these sections. When we get to, we're going to get to sections of stories that have plots to them, and they're a little bit easier to follow, and you hopefully will get pulled into the narratives themselves. So you know that so Joseph had Ephraim and Menashe, right? Two sons, and they become like the house. They become two separate tribes, at least in some of the traditions. And now we go on to first Menashe and then Ephraim. So if someone would like to read, Diane, would you like to read 27, 28?
And not right now. I'm having
Okay.
a little trouble.
No problem then. Sure, Sue Ortner. There you go.
Manasseh did not dispossess the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its dependencies, or of Tanakh and its dependencies, or the inhabitants of Dor and its dependencies, or the inhabitants of Iblim and its dependencies, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its dependencies. The Canaanites persisted in dwelling in this region, and when Israel gained the upper hand, they subjected the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not dispossess them.
So much for John, back to you. So much for the Lord being with Joseph, right? This is Joseph. But apparently, again, just in that the section of Bethel, that's where it was important for the Lord to be with, according to this narrator. But this part, less so. And then you've got this kind of balance between this conqueror who just can't get it. They can't conquer the whole thing, but they still put the people to forced labor. This is in our books. And yes, I know that other nations, all the other nations did this as well, but it's important for us to say this is part of our history. And when somebody reads this, now jumping to modern times, if the little kid that reads this in class and sees this, and the Canaanites are perceived as the enemies, and that little kid is being raised in either pre-statehood or in Israel, and there is somebody who's perceived others that have not yet been dispossessed, this is in the back. This goes into the background for better and for worse. And then, not to take sides, but to point out that's it, right? That's in the background. And so you will hear this amongst settlers, this kind of talk. Some of the younger, the ones, you know, the Narei Gvaot, the young men of the heights. This is the attitude. Attitude is that, well, they got away with it. They're still there, but they shouldn't be. And therefore we'll take advantage whenever we can. But back to the simple meaning of the text, not a lot to be said there, other than if we could see the map again, Madalena, please. Right, so you see Menashe has a huge section, right? You'll remember that they asked for the other side. They were part of the group that asked for the other side. They're really supposed to be over here. That was in that dialogue between them and Moses before coming in the very end. But really, they, you know, and you have these places. Megiddo, Tanakh, Dor is on the shore, on the sea.
The source takes place in Megiddo.
Yeah, Megiddo. Yeah, this is the area that this is the area of the source. Right. But it also includes Shem, which is a city, Nablus, which is connected to the Joseph stories. That's where the grave of Joseph is, a place where they call the grave of Joseph is. So you see, it's a huge area, and it goes really from the sea all the way to the quite deep into Jordan, what would today be Jordan, right? Okay, and as long as we have the map up, let's just look at Ephraim. Ephraim is a much smaller area. And Ephraim is where Bethel is, which is north of Jerusalem. And Shiloh, or Shiloh, as many of you know, these are places that are famous. Beit Haron becomes an important name in the book of Maccabees. Gezer is a very important archaeological site. There's the calendar of Gezer, and there's a kibbutz there with a Reformed synagogue today. And in Afek, there is a huge underground water, water. A lot of the water of Israel today comes from this area of Afek. Okay, we can go back to screens now. If somebody else could read then, Richard, are you up for reading 2932?
Okay, 29 to 32. Nor did Ephraim dispose the Canaanites who inhabited Gezer. So the Canaanites dwelt in their midst at Gezer. Zebulun did not dispossess the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalo. So the Canaanites dwelt in their midst, but they were subjected to forced labor. Asher did not possess the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon, Halab, Achzib, Helba, Abkik, and Rehob. So the Asherites dwelt in the midst of the Canaanites, the inhabitants of land, for they did not dispossess them.
So this isn't sounding so good, is it, right? Without going into details, right? It doesn't sound so good. The book of Joshua, according to this first section of Judges, didn't really do what it's supposed to do. There's just so much of this land where the people are there, but they haven't conquered it in that ideal way that we were led to believe from the Torah itself. And so this is kind of an update of reality, which will set the stage for the stories, the short stories we're going to have going forward of smaller groups of one tribe or a few tribes that have allied together, but never the entire country, so to speak, the entire 12 tribes. If there's nothing else, I'd like to move ahead towards the end, but I'm happy to answer. Say if any. You'll see place names that perhaps you know. Achziv, especially one of the most beautiful places in Israel, in northern Israel. Okay, then. And so, Gary, would you like to read for us?
Which number?
We're at 33.
Naphtali did not dispossess the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but they settled in the midst of the Canaanites, inhabitants of the land, and the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath had to perform forced labor for them.
Okay, so let me just find Michael's here. Where's Michael's screen? There you are. Okay, Michael, I asked you, I knew you should be able to unmute. Just a second. Let me just say, so Beit Shemesh may or may not be the same place that we know as Beit Shemesh, but it has to do with the god. It's the house of the god of the sun, of Helios, right? Known as Helios afterwards. And you have the same story over. I mean, we're just going over the same kind of stuff. Michael, did you want to ask something?
So yes, Rabbi, isn't this in some ways describing the situation of today on the West Bank? In other words, not dispossessed, but it's sort of forced labor. In other words, at least from a West Bank perspective, restricting their ability to do what they want.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's only half the story, right? Because if you do have, and it's not up, but if you do have Palestinians who they put that in many ways put themselves as the Israelites, and it's the Israelis who have not been dispossessed, and they're the ones that need to be put to. In other words, yes, it is a reflection, but it could easily be used, especially by Christian Arabs. You could reverse it and just say we're at the down right now, but in the same as say at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, before that the Assyrians, right? So, yeah, I don't want to overdo it too much, but yes, I do want to say that this is in our background, and not only is it in our background, but it is in the foreground in some people's minds, and certainly was in the 60s and the 70s after the 6-Day War. And still to this very day in many people's minds. And even if they're not quoting you, Judges, I still think I feel that's in the background of the discourse. Now, is this slave labor? What's being done now? You know, you could easily say no. People get paid for work. There was time when the Palestinians were were what the Latinos were for California when it came to farm. It's not the same as much anymore because of security reasons. Now it's Thai workers in the fields and Polish workers, at least when we were still in Jerusalem, in Jerusalem was being built by Polish workers that came over or from other countries around the world. South Tel Aviv is filled with immigrants or migrants or refugees from Africa and different places. And all these people, while it's not forced labor, it's certainly not, they're not getting paid the same as an Israeli would get paid, a Jewish Israeli. Ella.
But isn't it in the West Bank, the Israelis kind of have their own villages and their own farms and so on. And so do the Arabs. The Arabs have their own grape farms and their own olive farms and their own.
Right, to a certain degree, yes, on paper, but in reality, very often it's that the Israelis have much more rights to do things and to move around than the Palestinians do, not just to move around, but for rights to the water. There's huge fights over who gets rights to the water and over pumping and things like that. And then there's really no place in the West Bank where the Israeli army can't go into if they want to, even though there's different areas and sections. And I don't want to get too much into detail, but very often people say, well, it's totally self-rule. It's not total self-rule. There's huge economic issues, health issues right now. If we take Gaza, with all the problematics of Gaza certainly isn't total self-rule because they're surrounded. Things can't come in and out without Israel's approval and permission. So so I don't know. I don't know that we need to go exactly, Michael, to this is what this situation is. There are those that would say so, and there are times when I feel so. But again, my goal here is just to say this literature is in the background. It's in the background of everything that's gone on in the state of Israel from the late 19th century, when Jews began to come back. And although it wasn't seen as a military conquest, it was still getting the land back. And that's the state of Israel is based on that premise. Whether we like it or not, that's that, and we need to deal with it, I believe, and we need to talk about it, discuss it, respectfully discuss it. So where does that take us? Of course, we discuss it differently than Israelis themselves because they're the ones that have the stake. But certainly us Jews who have a strong relationship, not just myself, but most of the members of our Jewish community feel very, very connected to the state of Israel. We have not only a right, but an obligation to be involved in that conversation, perhaps a little bit more distance, but involved. Maybe at some point, I will put up Art Green in his, my teacher, Rabbi Arthur Green, in his new book about Judaism, has a Judaism for the World, has a chapter which is a letter to my Israeli brothers and sisters. And in a very eloquent way, as he knows how to do, he explains why it's important for Israelis to understand that American Jews not only want to, but need to be part of that conversation. Okay, so what I'm saying is I don't want to overdo it though. So let's go on to the last section, if we could. Eileen, would you like to read that last section, please?
Amorites pressed the Danites into the hill country. They would not let them come down to the plain. The Amorites also persisted in dwelling in Har Haris, in Ajalon, and in Shalbim. But the hand of the house of Joseph bore heavily on them, and they had to perform forced labor. The territory of the Amorites extended from the ascent of Ekabrim, from Sela onward.
Okay, so there's a lot of places that people may recognize. A lot of fun. Could we go back to the map, please, Madalena? So here is Dan. and presumably the Amorites are here, and they're pushing this way, pushing Dan up into the hill country. The hills start here, right? This is the coastal plain, and then there's the hillside, the hills that kind of go up all the way to here, and then they start to go down to plains on this side of the Jordan River area. So one of the interesting names here is Maleh Akrabim, which many people you'll remember is way down here, right? That's down in the Negev today. So there must have been Maleh Akrabim means the heights of the scorpions. It's just a lovely name that people like to remember. The Maleh Akrabim that I'm thinking of is down in the Negev on the way to Eilat. Okay, yes.
At what point did Dan go up north?
So we're going to have a story. So Dan is over here, and that's why when people talk of the Tel Aviv area today, they say Gush Dan, the Dan block. And that's why the bus company in Tel Aviv was called Dan as opposed to Egged and the other parts. But I don't know year-wise, and I don't know how things are done archaeologically, Ella, but the story of Samson and Dam is still going to be down here. So we're as far as the book is concerned, but they're still down here. But at the end of the book, it's kind of like the addendum to the book of Judges. They're going to be going up here to the very top. Hence, we have this place here called Dan, and that's what you're thinking of Tel Dan, and that beautiful area. Okay. The other name that we experienced in this last one was Ayalon and Shalabim. Though Shalabim is a kibbutz today in between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, Ayalon is that whole area. Nachal Ayalon, the Ayalon River is in that area, and the freeway, the main freeway that goes through Tel Aviv is Kvish Ayalon. Okay, Ayalon means a little heart, a little deer, a little kind of Ayal, a little, what do you call it? Little animal, a kid. All right, we can get rid of the map, please. Thank you. And that's the section that I wanted. I'm happy we got at least a good piece there. Again, please, we're going to go through another chapter or so of this bouncing around, which is setting the stage for where we really want to go, which are the interesting stories of Judges about local heroes and coming together and falling apart, and how God has a hand in this or does not have a hand in this. And that's why I emphasized, John, those two places where God did make sure the Lord was with them in those cases, but we're going to see going forward in the Judges, sometimes the Lord is with them and sometimes the Lord is against them. And according to this book, the way it was edited, it's very clear when. There's nothing left for question. And finally, just to the reason that I called today deceitful defeats was that backdoor entrance into the city of Bethel, which there's nothing evil about it. It's nothing particularly deceitful from our point of view, but the enemy, we did have some help from the enemy, and that's a little bit reminiscent of Rahab. A little bit reminiscent. Okay, have a problem here. Okay, a little bit reminiscent of Rachav or Rahab, the prostitute who's living in the walls of Jericho, something a little bit similar to that. And then finally, military matchmaking. And I said what I said about Achsa. Just one more point about Achsa. It's Aleph, Kaf, Samech, Ayin. If you rearrange the letters, you get to the word Kaas, anger. And the rabbis have a midrashic tradition that say she was so beautiful that she caused all men who saw her to be angry at their wives, that they weren't as beautiful as she was. So if you missed any misogynistic kind of sexist comments, I brought you one from the rabbis right there. Did you want to say something, Pansy? No, okay. Anybody else? I thought I saw a hand raised. Yes, Harold, please.
Okay, I have a question and then a quick comment related to that question. You may have covered this in an earlier session, but about when do you think the book, this would have been written?
Well, there's written and there's edited. And this is part of the editing. This is very much part of the editing. So I don't know,
Say after King David?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say edited after King David. What I will say is there will be stories that may be from earlier.
Okay, because the reason I ask is going back to in 17 to 20, it says the Judahites, took possession of the hill country, but they were not able to dispossess the inhabitants of the plain, meaning the Philistines.
Right.
And that, from an archaeological point of view, is probably true, because generally from archaeology has found from between about 1200 BCE to 1000 BCE, during roughly those 200 years, that there developed a proliferation, meaning hundreds of small settlements which have been identified as Israelite or pro-Israelite settlements in the central hill country of Canaan. And that the Philistines were, of course, by the sea in Ekron and Ashkelon and Ashdod and so forth, and that there was warring between the Israelites and the Philistines, but there were lots of times apparently where there were not wars, and it's been found that there have been Philistine pottery found in some of the Israelite settlements and vice versa, so that there was certainly some kind of trade or exchange or some kind of interaction between the two that didn't necessarily have to do with war.
Right. So if I liken it to looking at a map, if we look at it a map from a distance, right, and we see a map, there's very clear lines, right, where one say, but of course, if we were to go really close, and this time in time, we'd see the lines are fuzzy. They're fuzzy. And so the same thing when you're talking about hundreds of years or even decades, but certainly hundreds of years in relations between people. Well, how could they do that? They were their arch enemy. Well, yeah, except for, there's Romeo and Juliet as well, right? There's all sorts of things that are porous.
Samson and Delilah.
There you go. Okay.
Okay.
All right. We have one more message, and then let's see that. Yes. So Pansy is asking, can I give the name of the author of the book you mentioned before? I'm doing my own separate research. Yeah. What book did I mention before?
Was it Arthur Green?
Oh, Arthur Green. Okay, yeah. So I'll be in touch with you, Pansy, with that material. Absolutely. Okay. Any other questions before we say goodbye?
No.
Thank you.
Well, whether you are on the East Coast, the West Coast, or I don't even know where everybody's from, but wherever you're from the mountain, from the desert, from Bethel, or from Gaza, wherever you might be. Thanks for joining us, and have a lovely, lovely weekend. Shabbat shalom to everyone. Bye-bye.